introduction. Good morning, everyone. Again, let me just extend my gratitude once again to Dean Valerie Bridgman for the invitation, to the Williams Institute, and to MTSO for their hospitality. You have been so welcoming, so inviting, accommodating. Thank you very much for your welcoming spirit. I'm also thankful to those who are online and for you who have come back for more of Lamentations. Yesterday we looked closely at Lamentations 1 and the ways exile is weaponized on confiscated bodies. This morning we turn to Lamentations 2, where the poet widens the lens and gives us something even more macabre, grotesque, spectacles of liquidated bodies remembered in layered lament. My aim is to attend to the poet's artistry and theological strategy, while also reading with a post-colonial sensitivity to the traces of human agency that remain visible beneath the surface. Here, empire shows itself again, not just as an event, but as a mindset and a machinery of violence that continues to reverberate in our own time. I want to first provide some additional background information. I'm locating Lamentations within a broader discourse on empire that comes from the prophetic tradition. Much of the imagery and ways of mapping empire mirror what we find in prophetic discourse. I'll first provide this context. In prophetic literature, military-led exile appears as a post-siege strategy of empire that extended the conquest of territories to human bodies. The prophets present this compulsory form of migration as a multifaceted and protracted experience in which the conquered are seized, contained, transported, and resettled in the territorial centers of the ruling empire. This brings into view the empire's active performance of exiling conquered bodies, forcing them to migrate afar in a deracinated state of existence. Heeding Vergara Figueroa's decolonial critique of forced migration studies, deracination is the underside of exile that lays bare the coloniality of empire-induced migration. To quote her, processes of deracination take place in the bodies, the cultures, and the territories involved. By situating exile within a tactile network of imperial violence, invasion, killing, and pillaging, the prophets also nuance exile as both a mass uprooting of conquered survivors followed by their violent dispersion. And we could see this in Isaiah 39, Jeremiah 20, 25, 52, Ezekiel 5, and Amos 7. During the besiegement stage of imperial conquest, toppled buildings and dead bodies not only confirm the empire's domination, but also express to the conquered the severing of kinship and homeland ties. Herein lies the inner workings of a migration that is forced upon the conquered by a dominating empire, for it represents more than a mere population transfer. Before the displacement phase of exile, the empire engages in a rupturing process through invasion, pillaging, and mass killings. This imperial violence begins as dispossessing force upon the conquered by disfiguring their routine spaces and fracturing memories associated with them. Jeremiah 6 and 52 and Isaiah 1 and Micah 3. Moreover, conquered people are embedded in a network of human relations that imperial invasion violently disrupts. The irreversibility of both the deracinating and migratory phases of exile speaks to a multiplicity of losses that in turn translate into a rippling condition of suffering, trauma, and pain. And this is the traumatic memory that lies behind Lamentations that I'm trying to underline here in this background material. What I want us to see here is that exile is never a neutral movement of people. It is embedded in the empire's logic of domination. For the conquered dead, life is extinguished by the murderous blow of imperial violence. Their corpses become objects of the empire, thereby joining the inertness of the conquered land. For such is the prophecy in Jeremiah 34:20, quote, "Their corpses shall become food for the birds of the air and the wild animals of the earth," end quote. Hence, the killing of people by the empire serves as a paradigmatic colonizing act, as their life potential, individuality, willpower, and heart's desire is relentlessly wasted away in an instant. And yet, in death, they become also objects of possession, like the land itself, possessed to signify the empire's power to dominate. With their corpses affixed to this meaning, their untimely deaths attest to their devalued lives as humans. That is, to render them possessible objects requires seeing them as such. Just the same, the lives of conquered survivors are also colonized through their exiling. This form of subjugation constitutes another colonizing act that transforms the conquered from proprietors of self to living property of the empire. As such, their life potential is extracted not by a single death blow, but through a protracted siphoning of their productive output. This is what Jeremiah refers to as seeking their nephesh, right? Seeking their whole lives, the kind that gives life to the empire. In this way, Steve Davison rightly understands exile in prophetic discourse as a violent project inextricably linked to a historical empire. As he describes in his book, Empire and Exile, this nexus is not, quote, a fixed and closed period, but rather an open-ended experience of absence from home. For Davidson, empire was the primary executor of this lived experience, particularly in the case of the ancient Judeans. There was what he calls, quote, the deep involvement of empire in the circumstances that necessitate the absence from home, end quote. To examine this exile-empire nexus in prophetic discourse, he directs our critical gaze. This is Davidson. He directs our critical gaze to attend, quote, to dislocation and movement, events and experiences that cannot take place without the intervention of empire, end quote. As Davidson keenly argues, quote, exile stands as more than a passive historical reality, but one freighted with the trauma of the loss of home, end quote. This correlation between trauma and historical loss coincides well with Dominique Lecapre's distinction between historical and structural trauma. In the ruined ancient cities of Lachish, Neo-Assyrian 8th century BCE, or Jerusalem, Neo-Babylonian 6th century BCE, we see Lecapre's notion at work that trauma does not negate what or who was lost. As he states, quote, the historical past is the scene of losses that may be narrated, albeit in the form of fallen rubble and charred masonry stones. These, quote, losses are specific and involve particular events and should therefore prompt our critical gaze to avoid, quote, enshrouding or etherealizing the de facto power structures. And he uses examples like apartheid, Nazi genocide, and slavery that have produced them. So that we're not rendering them abstract. To give specificity to the exiling of people in the prophets means examining the historical trauma of losses, such as in familiar spaces, routine activities, loved ones, and personal property, at the juncture of prophetic prediction and empire as an inevitable reality. As Davidson writes, quote, exile evokes the visceral experiences of the inequities of geopolitical power and the resistance to dominant power, end quote. This de facto imperial violence that produces material suffering has its way regardless of the moral frameworks used by surviving victims to explain it. Following Macabre's theoretical framework, raising theological questions of absence with respect to divinity reflects structural trauma and should not in turn absorb or subordinate the significance of the historical trauma. In contrast to some Western readings of empire-induced trauma in prophetic discourse, the conquered victim's inability to narrate does not constitute the totality of the historical event itself. Indeed, the countermove to make sense of their historical losses using a theology of divine causality aligns closely with Macabre's notion of structural trauma, which, as he indicates, quote, is not an event, but an anxiety-producing condition of possibility related to the potential for historical traumatization. Equating this coping strategy with the raw historical realities of imperial violence is reflective of what Macabre calls, quote, reductive theoreticism, which for him involves deriving historical from structural trauma. Here, theoretically inclined Western biblical critics exemplify what Macabre identifies more broadly, namely a tendency, quote, to see history simply as illustrating or instantiating more basic processes, end quote. This is where the horror deepens. Empire does not only uproot, it devours. In John On's review of biblical scholarship on the exilic period, he raises a similar concern about critical readings of the traumatic experience of the Neo-Babylonian exile. Quote, should we reduce the complexity of the exilic experience, which involved multi-layered socio-economic variables, to simply a religionless one? End quote. On the surface, prophetic discourse offers a theological response to a traumatic condition by attributing empire and exile to divine judgment. Franz Fanon theorizes about this coping strategy for colonized people in Wretched of the Earth. Quote, in the same way the native, colonized, manages to bypass the settler, colonizer, a belief in fatalism or fate removes all blame from the oppressor. The cause of misfortunes and poverty is attributed to God. God is fate, end quote. For the ancient Judeans and Israelites, historical empire, whether Neo-Assyrian or Neo-Babylonian, was a socially felt system of violent power that at its core was driven by an innate human desire to dominate. At their most basic level, ruined structures and human remains point first to human agents on the ground producing this destruction and death. While Western historical critics like Peter Ackroyd urge caution regarding the relative value of prophetic discourse, the grotesque and the vulgar used to forecast are remembered imperial violence carry an affective conviction in the deadly reality of empire. Beyond merely expressing an attitude, the prophets describe this violence with firm conviction that insists on the empire's capacity to deliver on suffering and produce human loss. While exile as a theology of divine punishment functions as a prophetic response to the historical violence, its execution was carried out by human agents of empire. In this way, the prophet's theology of exile is encoded with a phenomenology of imperial violence. Here, the lived exile is not subsumed under the prophet's theology of exile, but rather integrated in a way that lends it validity. Prophetic discourse illustrates a sobering clarity about imperial violence, particularly when it is depicted in grotesque and vulgar forms. And I would invite you to read Isaiah 13, 34, Jeremiah 16, and 25 and 29, Ezekiel 5 and Ezekiel 6, Hosea 13, Amos 1. It discerns empire as the operative force on the ground producing exile. Consider these words from Jeremiah 38, verses 2 and 3, which predict the Neo-Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem. The mindset of empire comes into focus here, lives measured as prizes of war. Thus says the Lord, those who stay in this city shall die by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence. But those who go out to the Chaldeans shall live. They shall have their lives as a prize of war and live. Thus says the Lord, this city shall surely be handed over to the army of the king of Babylon, and he will take it. The theological critique that permeates these texts does not exhaust their sapiential value. They hold wisdom. By slowing down our reading, we allow the subtleties of meaning to emerge from the interstices of this critique. Here, a human-made system of empire shifts from being an imperceptible flicker of meaning to a visible structural frame that undergirds the prophet's theological judgment. To pause our reading in this way is to suspend the surplus of theological meaning, revealing underneath an imperial system of human making that specializes in producing a particular kind of death experience, quote, by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence. Accompanying this deadly imperial reflex or habit is an organized project of exile, the seizing of bodies, quote, as a prize of war. This secondary wisdom in prophetic discourse exists as a given state of awareness for how human-made empires operate. Hence, how might the taken for grantedness of empire in prophetic discourse signal a way of knowing for contemporary readers unaware of empire's fundamental nature? More specifically, does this awareness of human-made empire in prophetic discourse uncover nuances of the exiling process that go beyond framing it merely as divine punishment? Certainly, central to these questions is the argument that the empire and its exiling project becomes given not through a divine process, but through human decisions. The human agent does the work to elevate the empire to power, primarily by carrying out its conquering violence against other humans. The paradigmatic features of this human-generated violence are mass death and exiling the people it conquers. Hence, what is given about empire and exile in prophetic discourse is the primacy of human labor and suffering that make imperial violence a taken-for-granted reality. In Western biblical interpretation, reducing the intentions of this discourse to solely theological purposes mystifies, and this is Frantz Fanon's idea, mystifies or etherealizes, and that's Dominique Macabre, understanding of how trauma is reduced. So this solely theological purpose mystifies or etherealizes the human-to-human power dynamics intrinsic to empire-led exile. In his conclusion to Exile and Restoration, is a very highly cited text by Peter Ackroyd in Understanding the History of Exile, still used today. He exemplifies this tendency with the following argument. Quote, "The exile is seen as judgment upon the people's life, but more than that, it is understood as lying within the purposes of God, not simply as judgment, but in relation to what he is doing in the life of the world," end quote. It is easy to see how Ackroyd's decentering of the human agent involved in imperial violence relegates the prophetic response to merely a goal of acceptance. You just simply have to accept it and go on. In contrast, the aim here is to remain on the ground level of this discourse, focusing on the human-to-human interactions within the context of empire-led exile. While treated as a given in prophetic discourse, this seemingly obvious detail is not automatically brought to bear in Western biblical interpretation. For it is by lingering with the humanness of empire-led exile that one activates a critical awareness of the paradigmatic operations of imperial power. Hence, humans violently subjugating other humans in the biblical text not only serves a theological purpose, but also maps an anthropology of imperial power. As such, comprehending the humanness of empire-led exile in prophetic discourse can enhance our discernment of subjugating power structures that force people to migrate in the present world. The prophets are not lacking in gory descriptions of a human-led empire tearing people away from their homeland and kinships. This in turn raises the question, what do these actions infer about the objectification and disposability of humans under empire? To execute the exile of several people requires the exercise of brute force. Implicated here are actual hands on bodies, seizing their flesh, controlling their movement, and ultimately determining their life's purpose. Knowing that people operate in this way under empire sharpens our awareness of how this regime of power recurs today. We are led to ask, how do hierarchical forms of power, the kind that empires wield to render other human beings disposable? Moreover, how does the human-to-human domain of the prophet's description of exile constitute paradigmatic encounters with empire-building structures across human history? Lastly, how does this awareness translate into an ethics of engagement aimed at dismantling present-day empire in its nascent stages? Foregrounded in my second lecture, this lecture, is the clarity of vision in prophetic discourse regarding how empire appears ever ready to produce an atmosphere of mass death and execute the exiling of many people. By defocusing on the prophet's theological response, and I know that may be problematic at a theological school, but just defocusing just for a moment for why people are exiled, what emerges are the human-driven mechanics of exiling people under empire. This seeing through their theology of empire does not negate its agential witness in countering imperial religious ideology, nor its therapeutic impulse to address post-conquest trauma. Ultimately, it seeks to account for how empire appears in prophetic discourse as a ready-made force that is naturally set on exiling people as a means of possessing them. For undergirding the prophet's theological critique is an empire resolute in its performance of mass material violence with gory precision. Hauntingly, the repetition of empire building in the region surrounding Israel and Judah, from the Neo-Assyrian to the Neo-Babylonian to the Persian, solidified the predictable nature of empire. Just as the prophets relied on the agricultural principle of sowing and reaping, you can see that throughout the prophetic literature. They also invested in the empire's predictable nature, right, to underwrite the veracity of their theological critique. Coinciding with the empire's predictability is its autonomous nature, as is evident in Isaiah 47:6. On the aged, you made your yoke exceedingly heavy. This is a critique that is issued against the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Or in Jeremiah 50:33, quote, the people of Israel are oppressed, and so also are the people of Judah. All their captors, these are the imperial agents, have held them fast and refuse to let them go. These critiques, aimed particularly at the Neo-Babylonian Empire, indict a surplus of human-generated violence. Such a counter stance directly challenges the acceptance theology of divine judgment that Ackroyd sees as central to prophetic responses to empire. In these instances, the human-led excesses of imperial violence reach a threshold of moral unacceptability and in turn reflects less what Ackroyd interprets as the purposes of God than an empire operating on its own accord. Propelling imperial violence to the point of excess points to a cumulative momentum that empire building inevitably generates. In other words, this autonomous surge of imperial violence is not arbitrary, but intrinsic to the mission of empire building, to devour, totalize, and dominate other people and the lands that define them. Despite its varied manifestations across time, empire building fundamentally entails a coordinated human effort to devastate the material reality of other people in unbridled ways. Hence, a central question for the ensuing discussion is this: if empire building moves from an idea to the excesses of violence, then where along this spectrum do we situate the strategy of exiling people? At issue here is not so much what happened, but how exile functions as a crowning imperial force, both driving the migration of conquered people and dictating their settled lives. So with this background in place, we turn to the poetry itself, to the acrostic structure of Lamentations 2, where the pain of conquest is gathered and ordered. The poet of Lamentations 2 has turned again to the acrostic technique for collecting and expressing traumatic memories of imperial violence. Beginning once again with the opening word, object, how, aha, shock is translated into a lamenting cry that dictates the mood for the second acrostic collection. Again, the poet's wound focuses on conquered Jerusalem as daughter Zion. Even the reference to God as Adonai, my Lord, intensifies the personal tone to the poet's lament. The emotional emphasis, however, falls not on daughter Zion, but rather on God's anger, literally his nose, which frames the entire opening scene. The anger of the poet's God toward Israel anchors the theology of Lamentations 2. This theology of divine retribution operates alongside the acrostic layering of traumatic memories, giving the collection a religious function that is culturally familiar. As such, the poet not only expresses lament, but more importantly attends to its pain using symbolic language, the acrostic as an archival system, and cultural religious beliefs. From a post-colonial perspective, this strategy of care subverts by decentering the Neo-Babylonian Empire as the supreme agent of Jerusalem's conquest and Israel's subjugation. Ultimately, to accept the empire's claim to autonomy is to concede to the defeat of Israel's God. Although it may seem problematic that the God of Israel becomes the primary agent of imperial violence, denying this privilege to the empire is itself a form of resistance that the poet presents as a source of healing. While this strategy tames the empire as a therapeutic response, the wounds beneath the poet's lament retain the imprint of human agents of imperial violence. Such a response recognizes the severity of these wounds. In other words, their intensity is registered in the poet's overlapping layers of artistry and diverse modes of meaning-making. And yet the complexity of form not only attests to the poet's care for healing these wounds, but also functions as what Beneduce calls palimpsests, expressions of tacit historical knowledge. The literal just lies right underneath these texts. Whatever the poet saw fit for treating the pain of conquest does not negate the fact that real bodies wielding actual weapons executed this violence. Beneduce describes this reality as the literal character of traumatic memories. Spread throughout Lamentations 2 are hints, subtle acknowledgments, faint traces of the human agents of imperial violence. Even where the God of Israel is depicted as the sole agent of this violence, history reminds us that it was executed by human agents. To arrive at this history, my reading of Lamentations 2 submits to the material pool in the poet's pain, piecing together the human-driven operations of imperial power from the poem's gaps. The poet's theology, symbolic language, and memories structured by the acrostic are not escapist, but rather culturally specific strategies of care that attend to the physical wounds to which they point. While lamenting the wounds of Jerusalem's conquest seeks to make sense of material violence, the poem's pain, which permeates its form and content, bears witness to its systemic cruelty and shameless extravagance. Though the poet's primary focus is healing these collective wounds, Lamentations 2 provides enough clues to map the material objectives of imperial violence. These appear both in the theology of divine retribution and in the macabre and grotesque scenes of starvation, slaughter, and mass death, that excess of violence, which, as Achille Mbembe argues, is an integral part of the stylistics of power, right? So there's this style that empire uses to exert its domination. For a contemporary world marked by empire-building violence, attending to the traces and palimpsests of empire in the poet's lament raises our critical awareness, one that not only anticipates imperial violence in its nascent stages, but also works to foreclose it as a future possibility. I think that's where the wisdom lies with these texts, is that it can help trigger a different ethical framework that could perhaps hinder the development of empire-building violence. Such a project honors the wisdom latent within the poet's lament, both in the poet's literary and theological repertoire of care for the empire's wounded, and in the macabre scenes that expose imperial power operating at a human level. Drawing on Beneduce's post-colonial trauma theory, the poet's lament of collective wounds constitute not simple flashbacks or traumatic dreams, but embodied cultural archives that defy reduction to mere beliefs or cultural idioms, or in the case of Lamentations 2, to mere retributive theology or literary artistry. By tending to the painful memories associated with Jerusalem's conquest, the poet reveals the fundamental nature of empire, for in these wounds lies the residue of a mindset and mode of domination, what Mbembe describes as its usual and grotesque art of representation, its taste for the theatrical, and its violent pursuit of wrongdoing to the point of shamelessness. The reading I propose here is not a linear historical analysis, but a critical gaze refracted through the poet's pain to discern a spectrum of imperial logics. Where the poet presents scenes of mass starvation, slaughter, and displacement, this gaze recognizes the corresponding human investment in the mindset, mission, and military of empire. Such connections remain incomplete unless they draw us to see them in our contemporary world. In many ways, this return to today's world affirms the human value of the poet's wisdom, a value denied by the human agents of empire. Hence, from this intersectional reading of Lamentations 2 arise questions we must now pose. How do the laments of starving people point us to imperial maneuverings and ambitions? Do the emotional wounds of families enduring mass deportation and incarceration disclose the human investments of yet another empire-building project? What ways of being are cultivated in our society that render empire-building conceivable? And how do we heal wounds inflicted by imperial domination, by systems of power that diminish human worth for the sake of supremacy, a supremacy made visible in humans treated as refuse? So, even in the poet's theological strategy of care, faint traces of empire's human agents break through. The poet's second acrostic collection of word objects presses directly into a theological inflected memory of pain, shock, and lament. Here the poet inserts the God of Israel into this memory as the just agent causing the wound. As a strategy of care, this theological move displaces the wound's imperial reality, assigning it cause instead to the God of Israel. Transfigured into divine punishment, the poet engages directly the material violence behind the wound through the bet word object of bilah. Following the acrostic's logic, each word object functions within an interlinked sequence, even as it serves as a discrete container of traumatic memory. Hence, the material violence evoked with bilah is interconnected with the theologically inflected memory contained in the aleph word object. Exploiting this dynamic, the poet deliberately detaches empire from the center of material violence, transfiguring it into a theological register that attends to spiritual, religious dimensions, resources with potential for coping. The bet word object contains a traumatic memory of material destruction, rendered through imagery of swallowing or engulfment. The subject of this violence is assigned to the God of Israel, whom the poet intimately addresses as Adonai, my Lord. In our reading of Lamentations 2, it is certainly possible to adhere exclusively to the poet's theological project for healing post-conquest wounds. For readers enduring similar wounds, displacing the empire from its position of supremacy can be a powerful act of subversion, offering relief from traumatic memories that, as Beneduce describes, quote, remain stubbornly present, surfacing in the most unexpected circumstances and moments, threatening icebergs against which life risks crashing every night, end quote. The poet, however, leaves open another option for readers: to stay with the materiality of these wounds. My reading, therefore, remains attentive to the hints, traces, and allusions to the materiality of imperial violence, not to discredit the poet's theological project of care, but to better understand this violence from its human dimension. Whereas the poet's lament guides us down a culturally tailored path of care, my reading attends to the literal character of the violence, seeking to distill its wisdom for a deeper analysis of how empire building operates. Delving further into Lamentations 2:2, the poet applies the divine act of swallowing as expressed in the bet word object, bilah. To human-built structures such as settlements and fortresses, staying with these architectural structures, their ruined state marks the violent reversal of their material purpose of providing protection and safety. Their physicality recalls a building process that required time, resources, and human labor. By the same logic, their destruction depicted through swallowing or engulfment also demands human energies, materials, and coordinated effort. The poet, however, subversively gives this historical plane a theological arc, thereby freeing the wound from being defined solely by the materiality of imperial violence. While bending material reality in this way may provide provisional healing, it does not change the fact that the swallowing devastation denoted by Bilah corresponds to the military invasion of a fully established empire. The act of swallowing up resonates with the prophetic depiction of imperial siege as an overwhelming flood, a conquest that engulfs and annihilates both people and buildings. This flood motif echoes Isaiah's portrayal of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in Isaiah 8:7-8, where, quote, "The king of Assyria in all his glory, it will rise above all its channels and overflow all its banks. It will sweep on into Judah as a flood, and pouring over will reach up to the neck, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel." Depicted as mighty floodwaters, imperial violence inflicts a totalizing devastation that consumes lives and ravages landscapes. In Lamentations 2:2, the divine act of swallowing up is coupled with the divine mindset of hamal, no mercy. When fixed on the materiality of the poet's wound, both mode and mentality align with the profile of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in prophetic literature. In Jeremiah 21:7, which we've already looked at, illustrates this use of hamal, where King Nebuchadnezzar is depicted as one who shall strike them down with the edge of the sword. He shall not hamal, not pity or spare or have compassion. So in Lamentations 2, the poet recalls the destruction of every human-made structure, dwellings and strongholds in verse 2, palaces in verse 5, booth and tabernacle in verse 6, altar, sanctuary, and the walls of palaces with the house of the Lord, verse 7, the wall and rampart of daughter Zion, verse 8, and even her gates and bars in verse 9. The doubleness is clear. Theology displaces empire, yet the wound is remembered in a mode of engulfing and a mentality of no mercy. This is empire's profile: to swallow without pity, to consume without restraint. Such devastation is the work of human hands, reducing palaces, walls, and sanctuaries to rubble, even when the violence is ascribed to God. Lamentations 2 thus preserves the obvious truth that empires annihilate through embodied agents, a truth sharpened as the poets turns next to empire as the human enemy of Israel. And I'm going to move past this other section where I look at the use of enemy and foe that is repeated throughout Lamentations 2, which also points to human agents that were behind the conquest of Jerusalem. So these are just some closing thoughts. As we have seen, Lamentations 2 registers the devastation of Jerusalem, not only in theological idiom, but in grotesque and macabre memories of slaughter, starvation, and displacement. And if you read further into the Lamentations, you could see more of those grotesque scenes involving starving mothers. The poet bends this history into the acrostic form, weaving theology, artistry, and lament into a cultural strategy of care. But beneath that artistry, the human agents of empire remain discernible. Enemies with hands that seize, mouths that devour, and armies that rejoice in ruin. This doubleness, God as agent, yet human empire as executor, creates a paradox that refuses to let us forget the materiality of imperial violence. It forces us to see how bodies become objects of empire, liquidated or possessed, and how memory itself becomes a site of resistance. For us today, the wisdom of this lament lies in its insistence that empire is not inevitable but built, with human decisions, human investments, human cruelties. And just as the prophets discerned its violence is predictable, its appetite insatiable, its ruin real, so as we remember with the poet of Lamentations 2, may we also cultivate a critical gaze that refuses to normalize empire's violence, sort of in this acceptance theology, and may we take seriously the call to resist its recurrence in our own age. Thank you.